Opposition's burden is not to prove that the war will end on our side, but show that the government teams make violence infinitely worse. Because while you may believe the genocide in the Darfur region is devastating, the reality is there is room for it to become so much worse. Violence is currently localized in Khartoum and Darfur, but it can spread. That is our argument on side opening opposition. First thing I'll do, I want to do a little bit of framing. Our argument, or our frame, is that the war will end anyway in a short amount of time for a few reasons. One, the RSF has functionally won the civil war and controls the vast majority of Khartoum. It's forced the SAF out of every major stronghold there. Two, Egypt is the largest backer of the SAF currently, but its support of the SAF is waning because Egypt's economy is in shambles. It is overflooded with refugees from Gaza and Sudan. The military government under El-Sisi is economically corrupt and incompetent. Therefore, SAF's biggest backer is now weak and out. Third, the RSF controls every major gold mine in Sudan, which gives the RSF huge supplies of funds, which it sells to the UAE for oil and money, which actively emboldens it and further weakens the SAF in comparison. Fourth, the conflict in Gaza will probably end in the next few months. Why? Because Netanyahu is a fierce Trump ally and wants to give Trump a quick win upon his inauguration into office. This is important because once the West can reorient some of its diplomatic focus away from Gaza, it has strong incentives to pressure Gulf states to end the conflict in Sudan. The strategic value of this observation here is, while the current situation in Sudan is bad, it is likely to end soon. Intervening now will only intensify and prolong the war, resulting in greater casualties and damages. First argument then, military intervention will likely fail no matter who the actor is, and this is terrible. Why? Realistically, there are two types of actors that could intervene, as per the OG case also concedes, so it's Western powers and then the African Union in joint support. This is bad, because this intensifies violence in Sudan because the West is perceived as a colonial power. In particular, Britain militarily colonized Sudan in the 19th century. Hence, the involvement or the perception
when the
that
one
the
new
West
case filed on
is
drops?
backing an intervention intensifies recruitment and worsens the genocide in Darfur, because now the RSF will portray ethnic Africans in the western part of Sudan as puppets of the West. But second, the body bag effect kicks in. There is limited political will in the West for a protracted and long war in Sudan because, one, the Sudanese war has been chronically undercovered in Western media, so people care relatively little about this in the West, but they do care about their soldiers dying in war. Second, the West is tired of forever wars. CF the wars it participated in Iraq, in Vietnam, and Afghanistan, where it received massive backlash. Three, this means that the West is likely to intervene, but subsequently pull out. This is bad because it creates an immediate power vacuum, which is likely filled by the RSF, which then government gets none of their benefits, or radical Islamist terrorists like the ISGS, which is far worse because their capacity to enact violence is also multiplied. But second, why is it also bad for African states or the African Union to intervene in this regard? One, because they lack the capacity to win these wars. Major African militaries are preoccupied with internal armed insurgencies. If you look at a map, when you look at places like Nigeria, which is flooded with resistance against Boko Haram, or the Lord's Resistance Army in Uganda, etc. But second, most African countries are still recovering from the economic devastation and harms from COVID-19. This strains their ability to spend on a long military intervention, and there is limited political will in most African Union countries to actively do so. But third, the African Union is actually divided on the Sudanese war, i.e., Egypt backs the SAF, whereas Egypt's geopolitical rivals back the RSF because they view Sudan as a proxy conflict. This means that the AU will be internally fractured by intervening, and this is often detrimental, especially when decisions have to be made relatively quickly as a union and as a bloc. Therefore, all of the military efficaciousness of their side of the house dissipates when the AU is involved. What is the impact of this? A couplefold. First, you needlessly intensify a conflict that we prove will likely end soon, and soldiers end up dying more on their side of the house. So obviously the impacts are things like civilian casualties and economic devastation, which is terrible for people's lives on ground, because while you may believe that murder is bad and genocide is bad, often many people are invisible victims of war. These are people who can no longer send their children to school, who can no longer afford a roof above their head, who can no longer see a political future for their lives in these countries. Often, these are victims who are no less who suffer no less, but are far more invisible. Second, you often expand the scope of conflict on their side of the house, which means that more countries get involved, which actively prolongs these conflicts and creates active proxy wars. Third, often you flood Sudan with weapons and arms, and then if you subsequently leave, guess who these weapons and arms get captured by? They get captured by rebel groups in Sudan who have infinite capacity to do violence as per their characterization. Fourth, you lose humanitarian aid. Why? One, foreign countries spend money on humanitarian assistance right now. We agree, maybe not all of it ends up to the hands of the people who need it most. Some of it still does. That is probably on net good. Where will the money come from if these same countries are going to spend it on the military and otherwise? Second, the aid is more likely blocked by rebel groups on their side because they see aid as being sent from these same sources that are literally invading them and intervening in their country. Therefore, the humanitarian aid corridor doesn't matter if the aid never comes in the very first place on their side of the house. Lastly then, yes.
Even if this strategy is true, literally think of the end goal of this case. For 50 years, a government that is carrying out a genocide, who kills protesters, and who will do nothing for the religious minorities is going to take place. Saying the conflict just ends just means one of the worst governments in history is actually established in the absence of us trying to take it down.
That also happens on your side of the house, but then you intensify the conflict in the meantime and you actively worsen the due process of it. Lastly, this worsens the involvement of foreign powers like Russia and Iran. Why is this the case? Because presently, Russia and Iran extract huge amounts of oil and gold from Sudan. The fear is that when Western or African powers intervene, this is perceived as a threat to Russian and Iranian control of resources in Sudan. Therefore, it is more likely they need to increasingly securitize and militarize the region. What does this mean? This often looks like Iran and Russia sending in more weapons, they send in more things like guns, and they send in more things like soldiers. And this is terrible because firstly, actively militarizing the region probably means there's greater chances of things like tripwires and accidents where often soldiers get into conflict. It also often means it is far easier for things like wars to break out in the region, even over smaller matters. Therefore, on their side of the house, it is far more likely that these conflicts not only prolong, they also intensify. And the people that end up getting harmed in the due process are the everyday civilians the OG wants to protect so dearly. Very proud to oppose. Am I good to go? Their counterfactual is immediately wrong. The likely scenario is that the SAF and RSF are competing forever and ever. Even if one gets in power, the other will likely try to militarily intervene and try to create a coup and disrupt the government, and therefore they massively and forever increase the instability in Sudan. But even if you buy their counterfactual that the RSF or whoever is going to be in power and everything's going to be stable eventually for some reason, firstly, we tell you that the RSF or whoever is going to be in power is going to be a bad government. They're going to continue the genocide in Darfur. They're going to be extremely they're going to persecute persecute people based on their religions, and they're going to do things like kill protesters. And that's what they do currently. They elongate that. Secondly, they don't respond to Manuel's arguments about how you create deterrence for the UAE to give support for the RSF, how you actually make sure that you have military power to be able to defeat the RSF. Secondly, they talk about how you're going to have the perception that the West is intervening and people are going to be mad and the conflict gets worse. No actual mechanism and no response to how the West and the UN are the only way you're going to be able to get enough military power to actually to actually create stability, right?
in terms of like the perception that like the U.S. is like the perception that the West is going to intervene and that's going to be bad and people won't accept you, that's actually likely not true. The people in Sudan are living in a state of extreme uncertainty. They're not happy with either side. They're not extremely ideologically attached to either side. So if a much stronger entity like the UN, like the West, comes in and says that we can promise you stability in a few years, they're most likely going to be able to accept them with relatively open arms, even if they have some criticism. Secondly, they talk about how there's going to be a power vacuum because the West is likely to pull out immediately. Firstly, note that this mechanism hinges on the immediate success of the West. And secondly, note that the West has an incentive to keep their word. They have an incentive to maintain their legitimacy and make sure that if they are intervening in a country, they do that in a successful way and not automatically go back to the previous instability. And secondly, they talk about how because the AU is going to be internally fractured, the military force is not going to be as good. In our case, the AU is not like the main power giving the military force, so this argument doesn't matter at all. But secondly, it's actually unlikely that the AU is going to be as divided as they say. So, and then they talk about how these weapons are going to go to the hands of violent groups. No mechanism as to how that's going to happen. They're going to go to the groups that the West supports, and they're going. And secondly, in terms of aid, they talk about how aid disappears on our side. No explanation as to why this is true. There is almost none in the status quo. The only way powers get incentives to give aid is if your boots are on the ground, as if this is your project, if you have ownership over this project, that is the point at which you get aid. Opposition can talk about how this is going to take a long time. It may take, even if it takes a long time, that is a period of time where the West is now invested in your country, where you're actively getting aid to people, where you're actively getting targeted operations in places like Darfur. Why is this important? Because even if they say like the SAF is going to be in power and therefore things are going to be stable, the reason why the SAF is uniquely unable to prevent against the genocide in places like Darfur and Khartoum is because they have a lot of their military power in the capital to make sure that another military coup doesn't occur. That means they can't afford to send a lot of militia into Darfur and Khartoum, the most vulnerable regions. These are the regions that the US and the West likely care about the most because of humanitarian concerns. So even if they have the power, even if they have a stable government, they're only going to be able to maintain their own power and not actually send military power to protect the most vulnerable regions. Secondly, we tell you that the West, first of all, has the reason why boots on the ground military intervention is necessary for the stability and for the functioning of a better civilian government is threefold. Firstly, you get the West to commit to the stability in your region. Why is this important? It's important because now the US, or the West in general, and the UN has already invested in you, and therefore the cost of taking all of that back is a lot harder. There's a sunk cost there, and they have to make sure that they succeed on their words. I'll take a POI from closing. Opening.
The UN has intervened at least 4 times in Haiti in the last 30 years, yet violence remains persistent. The question you've got to answer is, what happens after the UN intervenes? Who successively governs after the peacekeepers leave the country?
I think it is the case that even if there is a long-term intervention, I've proved to you that there's going to be aid for the most vulnerable people and military help for the most vulnerable people in Sudan. That is most important because they don't get stability on their side either. But secondly, I believe that in the case of a Western intervention, that's the point at which you actually get a stable institutional and stable government because the UN and the West have incentives to make sure that your government has the institutions that is required to maintain a democracy, and also will closely scrutinize your government to make sure that things like a military coup won't happen. That is to say, it'll help you coup-proof, it'll help you make sure that your military is functioning in a way that is professional and not having its own ideological beliefs. Secondly, we tell you that the US has a massive incentive to send other forms of aid because you make your own troops safer, you make the region safer, and you have a direct incentive because your boots are on the ground. And this aid goes to the most vulnerable regions. Thirdly, we tell you that the U.S. because of the fact that the U.S. and the West are there, it means that the likelihood of the SAF and the RSF having similar amounts of power and therefore always vying for power and being violent towards each other is lower, because now we make sure that one of them can significantly overpower the other. That massively decreases the likelihood of violence going forward. Very, very proud to propose.
Sorry. Opening government has no case. Their aim is to displace the RSF from Sudan. Problem: who governs Sudan post the UN leaving? The likely answer is the SAF, according to opening government's analysis. Problem: who committed the genocide in the early 2000s in the Darfur region? Hint: it was the SA-fucking-F. Opening government has no comparative. The best claim they make is that you temporarily reduce violence, with zero explanation of the long-term benefit. Our case is simple. When the West intervenes, what you get is Somalia all over again. The West intervenes for 6 months. You temporarily increase violence. The West then leaves as the body bag effect kicks in. The resulting increase in violence, the increased power for radical Islamist groups to seize influence across the country, means the genocide gets worse. Opening government is right. There is an epic humanitarian crisis in Sudan. That crisis gets worse on their side of the house. Do not let the rhetoric fool you. First question: will the intervention succeed? Opening government has 3 reasons. They are all silly. Reason number 1: the terrain in Sudan is favorable for an intervention. Nonsense. There are 2 places where the conflict currently happens. The first are major urban centers like Khartoum and Port Sudan. Problem: urban warfare is notoriously impossible. If you don't trust me, ask the people in Stalingrad in 1944 how they felt about urban conflict. Why is urban warfare difficult? Because the precision airstrikes that Manuel wants to prop do not work in urban areas. Hint: you know what happens when you try to do precision airstrikes? You get Gaza, mass humanitarian civilian casualties, because you cannot target specific sites. You lack intelligence about where forces are operated, which means civilian casualties get worse on their side of the house, which not only means you don't displace the RSF, you kill civilians in the process. Secondly, the violence is often occurring in underdeveloped rural areas in Darfur. The problem is that these areas are low population density zones. That means in order to create opening government's humanitarian corridors, you need a huge mass of peacekeepers, tens of thousands of soldiers manning the guardrails. Why is that a problem? There is no political will for that scale of intervention. At best, what you get is what Haiti is currently experiencing. Kenya promised 2,500 peacekeeping forces by January of 2024. It is now January of 2025. There are fewer than 1,000 UN peacekeeping forces. Here's the reason you will never get the scale of intervention needed for opening government's benefits: because they want this to be a UN-led operation. Problem: UN peacekeeping operations, by definition, cannot be offensive. They can only be defensive in nature. The problem is you must recapture territory by opening government's own concession, so the UN lacks the internal political will to justify the large-scale intervention supported by opening government. Problem number 2: the African and Western militaries that they want to back this intervention do not have the military capacity to operate effectively in Sudan. Why is that? The major African militaries that could back this are bogged down by high levels of inflation, high levels of youth unemployment, political instability, CF the Kenya protests this summer where the parliament building was literally stormed, and internal armed insurgencies. But the Western militaries they want to intervene are also unlikely to back this on a large scale, not only because of the body bag effect I've already described, but also because the West has other priorities it is more interested in. For example, the Trump administration will pivot increasingly towards East Asia and deterring conflict in Taiwan, which which means the level of backing opening government realistically gets in the long term is limited. Why is this a problem? In addition to the fact that there are other UN peacekeeping operations that now probably get defunded or lose personnel as you reallocate soldiers, for example, from Haiti to Sudan, you get limited benefits on their side. The second argument opening government makes for why this works is that you deter abuses because there are boots on the ground. I'll flip this argument in 4 ways and explain why abuse is worse on their side. Flip number 1, Hemedi, the leader of the RSF, is a strongman leader who has staked his reputation and image as being a strongman. When the West intervenes, that strongman image can only be maintained if he doubles down on violence to show he is not scared or deterred by the presence of UN peacekeepers, which means, if anything, even if violence is unstrategic in certain areas, for example, even if it's unstrategic to engage in mass civilian slaughters in areas controlled by the RSF, there is now an incentive to do so and to not appear weak. Flip number 2, they say they want to kill the leaders of rebel groups. This is worse because if you kill the leader successfully, by the way, never proven that you have the capacity to identify, track, and kill these leaders, then this causes groups like the RSF to fracture and splinter when their leadership disintegrates. Problem, when you fracture rebel groups, the resulting consequence is more violence because you increase inter-rebel violence and inter-rebel conflict, which means not only do you get a genocide in Darfur, you also get a genocide throughout the remainder of the country. So even though there is violence in Sudan presently, you expand the geographic scale at which that violence operates. Flip number 3, Western military forces are highly likely to commit mass human rights abuses. Why is this? Setting aside the empirically obvious fact that every major UN peacekeeping operation has been besieged by sexual assault of young women on the ground and high levels of civilian casualties, it is because this intervention requires high levels of civilian casualties. Why is that? Because the RSF embeds itself amongst civilian populations to deter airstrikes from rival forces. This means that you necessarily must kill thousands of civilians to even enter Sudan on their side of the house. Flip number 4, UN peacekeepers are highly likely to be killed en masse on their side. Why is that? Because the RSF knows that the UN is likely to reduce the scale of its involvement if its casualties become sufficiently high. So there's a huge incentive now to kill as many UN peacekeepers as possible, which is why the Kosovo example doesn't work, because it's not airstrikes, it's police officers, they can be killed. Opening government's final reason why this works is that you deter the UAE from funding the RSF. Flip this argument. The fact that the West is now militarily intervening in Sudan makes this a de facto proxy conflict for the anti-Western axis of resistance to fight back against Western intervention. Think about what Iran, Russia, China, North Korea do in response to this policy. It is to increase arms sales towards the RSF. You might say, aha, but Russia can't do that. The war in Ukraine is happening. No, the war in Ukraine probably ends this year because Trump has explicitly backed promised to end all aid to Ukraine. So the largest militaries in the world, and Russia and China, increase their level of involvement. Closing.
Yeah, you haven't proved that you get permanent peace. You have provided no reasoning to believe that the RSF ever stops at all.
Yeah, so let's chat about the counterfactual, but I just want to be clear. There are no good guys in Sudan. There is no good ending to this conflict. Our claim at opening opposition is not, and closing opposition cannot seriously claim we end the war. This is ridiculous. Neither team does. This is a question of there are people who will die in opening government's world that do not die on our side. There is a genocide ongoing. This does not justify creating a second genocide in the country. But let's chat about the counterfactual. Why can it get better under our side? 2 reasons. First, mediation is likely to work in the long term. Here's why. Because the origins of this conflict are not that complicated. The RSF and SAF disagreed on the timeline for reintegration into a single military force in Sudan. When the West pivots its diplomatic focus away from the conflict in Gaza, or more broadly as the Trump administration reduces its care about Israel, the consequence likely is increased diplomatic focus on mediating a reintegration timeline for the RSF and the SAF. No, this is not guaranteed to work, but it's probable that it could. Why is that the case? First, there are strong economic incentives for both sides to eventually acquiesce to a deal. Conflict is costly. You face huge levels of sanctions, and there are therefore rational, selfish economic incentives for leaders of both the RSF and the SAF to eventually agree to come to the table. But secondarily, over time, the SAF is going to pivot away from war fighting. Its aim is to become a governing body, and it does not want to be sanctioned en masse by the West because it saw what happened to Omar al-Bashir when he engaged in the genocide. Hint, he got couped. Their incentive is to moderate. There is no benefit on Gov. The situation gets worse. Oppose.
Opening
government's reasoning on the winnability of this war is both pessimistic and braggadocious. Because at first speaker, they're like, well, maybe we'll get some aid in. We know the terrain, like, hopefully we'll win it. And you might say, well, that's good because their burden is low. But actually, they do need, I think, to get a win to get their benefits, because they have to repel the RSF and get the benefits of things like aid. But then at second, they're like, our vision of peace is the total defeat of the RSF, which I think, to be fair, points out is unlikely. We at Closing Government will be both more optimistic and more modest. We will explain why the context of this conflict is a winnable war, why we can broker a power-sharing agreement like the integration framework of 2022 that failed, but that will work this time. And then finally, I'll impact why stability is the most important impact in this debate, bringing down the burden on the government bench. Firstly, why is this a winnable war? I'm going to integrate some rebuttal to opening opposition throughout this. Firstly, I want to note that the SAF is strong for a number of reasons. I would point to 4. Firstly, they have the support of Egypt, and I would note particularly that that support manifests in the form of being given conventional weapons, things like missiles, things like tanks, and I think those things are incredibly important in this context because they are far more efficient than boots on the ground. They are, for instance, able to take out whole troops of RSF soldiers. They prevent things like reinforcements from reaching Khartoum. But secondly, they have the majority of land held in Sudan, which I think is an advantage in and of itself. It means that you have more resources. It means you have more, potential personnel that you can recruit. Thirdly, I would note that al-Burhan has the advantage of being the de facto leader of the military at the point where the coup occurred in 2019, which I think means that he has quite a lot of credibility, quite a lot of troops behind him. But finally, I would note that they are I guess I already said, they're engaging in traditional warfare, which is particularly efficient. What preemptive responses do we get from opening opposition? They first say that Egypt is weak. I think this is pretty uncomparative. Like, they may be, suffering some economic problems. I don't think that that's sufficient to explain why they're unable to give meaningful numbers of weapons to the SAF. And I also think they concede that Gaza is going to end, pretty soon, which suggests that some of the stresses they point to that might affect Egypt are only temporary. Secondly, they're like, well, the RSF has Khartoum. I think the problem with this is it's framed as analysis as to why the war is kind of over, I guess, from the perspective of the SAF. They do no work to explain why the RSF would ever stop there, which means I think that it is just not true that either side is particularly likely to give up power wholesale on their side. Finally, they're like, well, precision airstrikes are not particularly useful in urban warfare, which means that resourcing the SAF is not particularly useful either. I think there are 2 problems with this. Firstly, as I've already indicated, you can do airstrikes on, for instance, reinforcements, which does meaningfully impact your capacity to fight urban warfare. Obviously, you need to get troops in order to successfully be guerrillas. But secondly, I would note that you can obviously provide resources on the ground too, which helps. It's things like, for instance, being able to have better information on, the network of guerrillas on the ground. It's, for instance, just having better protections, meaning soldiers are more able to fight in close quarters. Those things are meaningful in shifting the tide in Khartoum. The next thing, though, I'd point to is that the RSF is weak. There are 2 reasons for this. Firstly, I would note that they are widely disliked. They committed a massacre in Khartoum in 2019, which pretty unsurprisingly means that they're not people's best friends. But additionally, I would note that fighting urban guerrilla warfare is something which is incredibly, I suppose, human resources intensive. It's something which means there are many, many men on the ground, and they are, if opening opposition wants to talk about things like sexual violence, that is where it occurs. It is RSF soldiers raping women in Khartoum. That is something which is bad, obviously, for your potential recruits, for your capacity to govern that city. It's also pretty terrible for morale. The second thing, though, I'd note is that they likely have diminishing support from people like Libyan warlords, because obviously those guys have supported them a bit up until now, but I think that diminishes because they economically need to have a good relationship with Egypt, which deters them from providing meaningful support. Finally, I want to just quickly note that I think it's pretty unlikely that a proxy war occurs. Opening opposition is pretty assertive that the UAE and Russia are decisive in this conflict. I don't think they prove that to sufficiency why they're likely to enter kind of whole scale. I think the UAE has indicated support at times for both leaders. For instance, after the joint coup, they provided financial support to both leaders. They gave Dagalo arms to send the RSF into Yemen, but that doesn't mean that they would actually support them in this particular conflict. And Russia, they have the Wagner group there. They like the SAF, but they also have finite resources. They're literally fighting a ground war in Ukraine. And additionally, they've just had the extremely embarrassing collapse of an ally in Syria. It's, I think, pretty unclear and not proven to sufficiency by this team that they would intervene in a decisive way. Finally, though, I would note that there is the desire to end the war. This war has been protracted. Both sides have territory. Both sides have international support, but that has not been sufficient to be decisive, which I think means that it is likely that foreign support of the kind of nature that government bench is defending is a tipping point. But finally, I would note that the reasons why the initial power sharing agreement was rejected are likely to change. Firstly, we know the specific cause of the problem here. Like, there was a disagreement about the time frame of the integration of the RSF into the SAF. We can change that in future power sharing agreements. Secondly, the former power sharing agreement provided the security sector with too much power, which allowed for further violence. And thirdly, the war, as it has happened, just had not happened yet. We are 15,000 deaths later. I think that that leads to things like war fatigue. It means people are more willing to come to the table. Why then is a power sharing agreement possible? But before I do this, I'll take opening.
Your case has a major missing link, which is why military intervention meaningfully changes
Yeah.
the balance of power. Even if the RSF is weak, that's why it has incentives to mediate under our side for OO's incentives.
Yeah, I'll do that now. So I think I would note, in terms of the power sharing agreement stuff, actually a lot of the analytical work here is done for me by DLO, in that they explain why there is potentially a willingness to come to the table, why, you know, it would be advantageous for people to be involved in a power sharing agreement. I think the problem with that, though, is all of their analysis as to why it might be appealing to have a power sharing agreement are kind of generic. Like, by their analysis, you would believe the power sharing agreement had already happened. Why then is military involvement the tipping point? I would make a couple of observations. Firstly, one of the reasons why the integration framework agreement initially failed is that it was all carrot, no stick. That is to say that there was obviously benefits, things like potentially coming in and providing economic aid, to adhering to it, but there was no, you know, kind of punishment or force provided for breaking it, which means that for the kind of leaders like opening opposition characterizes, strongman leaders with long-standing disagreements who are militaristic, a mere power-sharing agreement is not sufficient without military force to back it up. But secondly, as I've observed, the over-empowerment of the security sector in Sudan was a problem with that agreement that can only be fixed when you have military presence on the ground to do things like, for instance, disarmament. But additionally, so I think that explains why it is necessary to have military involved in brokering this power-sharing agreement, meaning we co-opt that benefit from OO. Finally, I want to explain why stability is urgent. This is important because it lowers the burden on government. Obviously, the RSF isn't good, but getting a power sharing agreement is just crucial. And secondly, it explains why waiting and watching and hoping for the best in the long run isn't an option. Firstly, urban warfare is incredibly damaging. Khartoum is where things like economic development would occur, and the destruction of resources is something which means you can never get out of wartime. The longer it goes, the less things like investment, like business, you get. But secondly, displacement and trauma becomes increasingly difficult to overcome as you lose records, you lose possessions, you make people far less likely to be able to establish a successful society. And finally, flows of migration increase destabilization in the region, expanding, and protracting the conflict.
The first thing I want to do in my speech is explain why the UAE and Saudi Arabia are not likely to be deterred in terms of providing funding. Why is this strategically important in this round? OO's main case is that of escalation, that you're going to lead to the increase in warfare and the increase of people being caught in the crossfire. But the problem with this analysis is that OJ has counter responses, which is we're going to deter the UAE and Saudi Arabia from giving funding that leads to escalation in the first place. And this is pretty important, right? Because if you look at their other analysis, it's all about why the US is going to be really bad at funding. Like, the US funding will decrease in the future. If this is true, if funding goes away, then the RSF just also wins on their side of the house pretty quickly as well. So they can't actually access a lot of their benefits of the extent to which conflicts can increase and be escalated in the first place. And I think this is the most important impact in this round, the escalation of conflict. Because on either side of the house, in a post-conflict society, whether it be the SAF or the RSF, maybe have some incentives to be moderate, maybe have some incentives to, be oppressive on either side of the house. Therefore, the largest margin in this debate then is the escalation and the prolonging of the conflict. How are we going to access this point? I'm going to explain why the the UAE and Saudi Arabia are not going to back down. So first, what are their incentives for giving funding in the first place? So they chose to back the RSF as the people most likely to win because they want to back the winner to exercise a couple of incentives. The first is business, where they often want to already have investments and want to expand investments in things like gold and agriculture in the region, and they think that by backing the leader, they can get better deals for things like agricultural, exports or imports in the future, and they want to have their own businesses in these regions as well. Secondly, I think they want to expand their influence in this region in order to decrease the influence of political Islam, which is against, their own nations, and they want to have this decrease, and they want to use the RSF as a proxy to make sure this doesn't occur. Why are these incentives more important than the fear of the United States? I'll take a POI in a couple of minutes, relax. So firstly, I think the United States is incredibly dependent on Saudi Arabia and the UAE for things like oil, where their other alternatives just really aren't doing so great right now, right? It's like Venezuela, where they can't support them because of Maduro, who they've taken a strong stance against. It's Russia, who they're obviously sanctioning the status quo. It's Ukraine as well, that is currently losing the war. It's incredibly volatile. It's hard to access the oil reserves. Even if the Russia-Ukraine deal is settled in the future, things like building up and rebuilding oil supply chains in the region is going to take a significant amount of time. Why is oil a really critical issue for the United States? I think decreasing the cost of living is politically central to the United States. This is the reason Biden lost, because of a higher cost of living that made people really, dislike him, because oftentimes your cost of living as an everyday individual voter is the most proximate thing to you. It's the grocery bills you have to pay. It's whether or not you can afford heating. It's the things that determine your day-to-day quality of life that people vote on that's often determinative in many elections. So the U.S. cares very deeply about their access to oil. And what this means then is that from the perspective of Saudi Arabia, from the perspective of the UAE, they know this and preemptively are not deterred because they do not fear any form of U.S. backlash if they continue to fund the other side. Secondly, it's the problem of Israel as well, where Saudi Arabia and the UAE are the only countries in the Middle East to currently have relations with Israel to any meaningful capacity through the Abraham Accords. And this is important because this means that the U.S. is also dependent on them politically as well, or geopolitically, because they know they have to ensure the support of Saudi Arabia and the UAE in the region as well, to ensure cooperation in terms of, for example, supporting Israel, because they know that they are the only allies in the region. But thirdly, they also face competition with China in terms of support in the Middle East. And this is because China has provided a lot of funding and investment in the Middle East. So, for example, giving infrastructure deals and helping with, building up railways or just general infrastructure in Saudi Arabia and the UAE. They built some in the Qatar as well, but those have declined. But still, there's a substantial amount of Chinese influence in general in the Middle East. Why is this important? This means the U.S. also fears these countries aligning more and aligning closer to China, and has incentives to want to appease them as well, which also gives the Saudi Arabia and the UAE more leverage and a greater feeling of safety to aggress the U.S. in terms of funding the other side as well. What is the impact of all of this? So I think this means that the Saudi Arabia and UAE are not going to back down. They're going to match U.S. funding dollar for dollar, and are going to increase massive amounts of support for the RSF. This is what leads to bloodshed. This is what leads to greater civilian casualties, and this is what leads to greater famine in the region and the killing of humanitarian aid individuals, which also harms the region as well. I want to weigh this against the rest of before that, OG.
We have yet to say it's going to be the United States in the way that described. All this analysis does is prove why if the UAE, if Saudi Arabia want to keep selling oil, which is literally what funds their economy to the United States, they have to fucking comply. So we take down the main funders of the RSF, and opening opposition fucking bullshit of Russia will join, which is already the counterfactual happening right now through Wagner, through Russian corporations, is not going to magically activate. It's already happening.
We said nothing about Russia complying. We agree you have fiat that the US will support them, but because of the game theoretic incentive, where even if the UAE wants to sell oil, they also know the US wants to buy the oil, so they will have no incentives to actually back down. So this unlocks the most comparative parts of the O impact, which is about the escalation of conflict. Also briefly going to point out, so the LO analysis about why Iran's going to securitize kind of doesn't make that much sense. Iran's also supporting the SAF. I'm not too clear where the margin here is, but I think this is an additional mechanism for our side, because the fact that the UAE and Saudi Arabia are anti-Iran and Iran is backing the SAF also is an additional incentive for them to also want to support the RSF instead, and also is probably a reason as to why the US funding is not going to be very popular, because it's going to be seen as supporting Iran because Iran is backing the SAF, which is an additional mechanism to about why US funding is going to be kind of shit. Second, let's talk about the comparative briefly, about why there's actual significant incentives for the RSF to reduce oppression and allow for humanitarian aid on the counterfactual. So I think the largest and best reason for this is that the Saudi Arabia and UAE have incentives to pressure the RSF to actually remediate oppression and to allow for humanitarian aid to pass. This is firstly because they have investment incentives, where conflict makes it difficult to do business in gold and agriculture and to transport goods through the railway or the pathway to export to Chad as well. But secondly, their entire goal of trying to reduce political Islam gets undermined when conflict and instability leads to the rise of Islamist jihadist groups that want to exploit the opportunity in the region and rise to power as well. So there's significant incentives from the people funding the RSF to want to pressure to mediate. I think this is a better incentive than what we get out of opening opposition, because OO just says, oh, you have like the RSF has business incentives to avoid sanctions. Problem: why do they like care about international support if they're doing genocide in the first place? Problem 2: why do their existing business interests and connections why are they not sufficient? We explain why their existing business connections will pressure them to mediate, which is the best incentive to have any comparative advantage in this round. So I think the difference in this debate then is that all of these incentives the Saudi Arabia and UAE has to stop, to have some form of mediation goes away at the point at which the US tries to intervene. And this is because they see a victory of the RSF as any prerequisites to having any sort of control in the region. So even if they comparatively have some incentives to moderate, when you threaten the chances of the RSF of securing victory, which is the prerequisite to any form of benefit, they now have incentives to no longer moderate and fund massive amounts of conflict, which leads to incredible amounts of harm. The final reason I think that there's incentives to mediate is that you also decrease the cost of occupation, where if you go too far in terms of conflict, this what leads to domestic resistance groups, which strains your profits and strains your resources when you have more domestic resistance. So therefore you have some incentives to avoid sparking this resistance, this forms of resistance, to ensure your victory. For all these reasons, oppose.
Oh, sorry, I've left it. Firstly, I'll rebut closing opposition, and I'll then explain why closing government wins the debate. Firstly, closing opposition. They have one extension, which is that other actors, for instance, like the UAE, still provide funding. The problem with this is, I think, sixfold. Firstly, it's a knife of OO. OO says Gaza is over soon, so the West has more resources, therefore, to, for instance, pressure the UAE to back down. Closing opposition's claim is that the UAE will continue to back down. I think even if you don't believe it's like a debate losing knife, I think it still mitigates the extent of their opening's benefit, which is bad faith. Secondly, this team does not do anywhere near sufficient work to prove that the UAE has strong enough incentives to bear the enormous cost of sending in increased military aid, supporting that in the wake of backlash, in the wake of other things. For instance, the UAE might support the RSF with regard to Yemen. That doesn't mean it is ideologically pro the RSF in every other context, no matter the costs. Thirdly, maybe it rebuts opening government. It does not touch our case. Our case, which is on the strength of the SAF and on other forces. And importantly, we explain why it's likely you get a good power sharing agreement afterwards, which doesn't hurt the UAE's ability to, for instance, extract gold or whatever from that country, because we say that your interests are still maintained. Fourthly, the US will still backlash against you. Firstly, I would note that the UAE often gains more from the US relationship than the US gains from the UAE. The UAE needs the US as an oil partner, so it is in fact the US who has the power there, not the UAE. But secondly, we note that the USA has a revealed preference for increasing oil prices for its geopolitical purposes, even if it cares about low cost of oil at home. See, for instance, Russia. So it's incredibly unlikely that the US would not take this pushback. And I note, Trump is a little bit crazy. It's likely that he'd be pretty pissed off by this. Next, they say, well, Saudi Arabia and the UAE have China on their side, but that is a non sequitur, right? The fact that that they are allied with China to some extent doesn't help them fight against the US or avoid, for instance, sanctions from the US, whom China does not want to antagonize even further, in particular, given that China is likely to face enormous tariffs from the US at its huge economic detriment, particularly when China is in an economic crisis at the moment from things like, for instance, overcapacity, the real estate crisis that has gotten slightly better but doesn't seem to be improving to any kind of substantial degree. Finally, I just don't think this is a significant contribution in the round. It's not weighed over opening opposition. It's not weighed over us. So let's talk about what we bring you at closing government. We end the war and we bring stability afterwards. And there's not that much weighing to do on this contribution because I think kind of everyone in the debate is sort of aiming at the same outcome, which is we bring the largest benefit in the debate. We actually prove that we avoid, for instance, the human rights abuses that OG rhetoricizes while also avoiding the risks put forward by opening opposition. And secondly, we raise the burden on this government bench, or opposition bench rather, by explaining why stability is urgent. And that first part of our contribution on why stability matters and matters now is what I'll look over at the moment. We explain that this puts an unjust government, like even if this puts an unjust government in power, even if civilians die, stability matters urgently, and that postponing this, which is what opening opposition wants to do, when they say let's just wait a while, the war will end later, is an enormous harm. You cannot turn back, which makes this debate substantially harder for opposition to win. We explain that destroying urban warfare makes it much harder to do investment later on because it looks like destroying businesses, destroying places where people live, which means it's much harder to come out of war later. It means you're more likely to inflame, go back into conflict, support more powerful reactionary political parties, for instance, when your country is poor. Secondly, that displacement and trauma become increasingly difficult to overcome because you lose records, you lose possessions, you lose houses, which means that you cannot go back to where you were if more people's homes have been destroyed. And finally, that flows of migration increase destabilization in neighborhood regions, which expands conflict across borders. And that explains why we have to do it now, even if you believe this solution is imperfect. So that's the first extension we bring. Second extension is why we're able to win the war. We bring a range of reasons why the RSF is weak and the SAF is strong and why intervention works, but why it doesn't end on its own, nor in a stable fashion without military intervention. And that, I think, is the very good POI from opening opposition. They're like, well, if the SRF is weak, why do you need military intervention? Here are 3 reasons why it is absolutely necessary to have a strong military presence. The first reason for this is because leaders of the RSF are not rational. We think they're gonna lose the war, but they're gonna keep fighting unless there is the obvious threat of, for instance, US military presence that you have there, which stops the bloodshed or at least stops it earlier. Secondly, I think it is far less embarrassing to stand down when you have lost a fight rather than, for instance, just agreeing to agreeing to stand down without that pressure of military on you. Finally, we think that the power sharing agreement, which is likely to happen afterwards, which there's precedent in 2019 and 2022, but we say the situation has changed positively now, is much, much more durable when you have the military around to uphold it, or when at least that military threat has been there. The power sharing agreement will crumble on their side without a strong stick in the form of US intervention. Yeah.
Western intervention will only force the RSF to the table if the RSF believes the West can defeat it. But OO shows that given the difficulties of urban combat and the body bag effect, the RSF probably...
I'm going to get to rebutting you right now. So what I'm going to do here is just rebut opening opposition's case, which will be, when I do it, a positive contribution for closing government as well. So they make a few claims. The first is that the war will end anyway. Their argument consists in pointing to some strengths of the RSF, gold mines and some territory. That's true, but it's not comparative to SAF strength, which Ellie proves is much greater. Secondly, they say that the West seems colonial, so this won't work. Note that it's the involvement of many states, not merely, say, the UK or former colonizers, it's African states too. And secondly, this form of intervention is not colonial, it is not desired. Finally, this claim is not impacted by them. Maybe people feel like the intervention is colonial, they don't care. Their better claim is that the West pulls out at some point because it cares about the own soldiers' lives. Opening government here says, well, the West wants to keep its word. I'm going to give a few much better reasons why the West won't pull out. Firstly, this is a fiat motion. I think we can assume this intervention carries on properly. Secondly, this is not a war of attrition, unlike, say, Russia and Ukraine, which means that it's easy for this to happen swiftly. Thirdly, even if one country pulls out, this is a global or, at worst, regional effort, meaning this doesn't stop the fighting. Fourthly, you have extremely strong reasons to, for instance, oppose refugee flows. If you're Ethiopia, if you're a country surrounding it, and if you're the US, who trades with many of those countries, this is exactly the reason why contra Haiti, for instance, and also contra Ukraine, people want to fight. Secondly, they say the AU is too divided and poor. If that is the case, in the worst case, just Egypt contributes. That's fine. That's a lot of soldiers. It's a lot of money. Secondly, it's possible to train those soldiers. For instance, look at the USA training Ethiopian soldiers for interventions in Haiti. Yes, which haven't been very good, but the Haiti example is disanalogous. Those people were not personally involved. Peacekeepers from Ethiopia and Haiti didn't have Haitians on their door. And finally, again, you have an extremely strong incentive to do so because you want to stem refugee flows. I want to note that closing opposition does literally nothing to respond to this extension. And if they want to have a chance in this debate, they need to properly rebut it. Finally, opening says, well, the rest does human rights abuses. I think that's much less likely, where you have, for instance, UN peacekeepers or the US overseeing other armies, because there's stronger legislation, there's more journalistic monitoring, you're better paid, and so less vulnerable to corruption. We win.
Are we good? First, let me knock closing government out. The premise of their entire case is that the SAF is strong. So if I'm able to rebut this, none of the arguments they draw from that, for example, that the RSF will strike a new power-sharing deal or have incentives to moderate or experience war fatigue or even believe that Western intervention is a threat, works. Why is the SAF overwhelmingly weak? They have two reasons the SAF is strong. One, you have the support of Egypt. Nonsense. First, there is a currency crisis in Egypt right now. Egyptian inflation is 32.6% and the Egyptian pound has crashed. You need foreign exchange reserves in order to buy arms. The reason why is Egypt is not a major arms producer in itself, but Egypt doesn't want to spend its dollars on buying arms, meaning it is unlikely to have substantial capacity to buy these arms. And this isn't a short-term problem created by the conflict in Gaza. Rather, it is caused by Sisi funding white elephant projects in Egypt in order to guarantee his short-term legitimacy while he tries to hold on to power. But these white elephant projects involved huge amounts of borrowing, and investors bet that the Egyptian currency wouldn't be able to sustain this borrowing. This is a systemic crisis in Egypt that they can't overcome. But second, Egypt lacks the incentive to continue funding the SAF. Why? Because the RSF is winning right now. Financing the losers of the conflict creates a risk of extending the conflict. Prolonging the conflict increases the flow of Sudanese refugees into Egypt, meaning Egypt lacks the incentives to fund the war, especially compared to the incentives of the UAE and Saudi Arabia that we named and closing government mostly ignores. Second, they say it holds the majority of the land in Sudan. The land the SAF controls is mostly in the midst of famine. El Fasher is the only big city in Darfur outside RSF control, and it is undergoing famine. Portions controlled toward the east, like Gedaref, are experiencing famine too. And there are two structural reasons the SAF's regions are experiencing famine and don't give them a strategic advantage in the war. One, the RSF controls supply chains into the region. For example, Chad under Idris Deby, Libya, South Sudan, all of them back the RSF, and as a consequence, the RSF has control over the capacity of imported food to reach the portions of Sudan that are controlled by the SAF. But second, Sennar, the breadbasket state of Sudan, is controlled by the RSF, meaning agricultural production is under the RSF's control, meaning the SAF's regions don't give them a strategic advantage. The third mechanism is the RSF is widely disliked by the broader people. No, thank you. Arab ethnicities in Sudan that support the RSS are generally much more economically well off than black ethnicities that oppose them. For example, the Janjaweed militias from the early 2000s that turned into the RSF had access to initial gold reserves that made the RSFs rich. That means the people in Sudan who have the most economic and political power like the RSF more than they like the SAF. This is actually worsened by their side of the house because when the West is involved, all the opposition to the RSF is likely to go away. Plus, the people who oppose the RSF most are most likely to flee and therefore not be relevant in the conflict. Second, they say this changes the power sharing agreement and changes disagreement on the time frame, and violence was just motivated by the lack of a power sharing agreement. This might have been true in 2019. It is no longer true. Violence is now motivated by a fundamental ideological struggle. 15,000 deaths doesn't cause war fatigue among the RSF. It causes frustration and it causes anger. A willingness to come to the table doesn't exist, and fatigue is less likely. There are a number of reasons why. One, because you feel anger when your leaders are targeted, as Manuel says. When your leaders are targeted, there's substantial martyrization. You feel like your leaders are really, really important. Please stop POIing me every 10 seconds. I'm obviously going to take you. As a consequence, this substantially weakens the region because there's substantial amounts of martyrization of the leadership that actually empowers the RSF. But second, the RSF usually hires fighters who are like extremely young men with a proclivity to violence and haven't experienced the war so far. So it's easy to escape war fatigue because it gets a constant input of soldiers who are young men who it constantly rehires and rehires from existing ethnic militias, meaning their claims on war fatigue are extremely likely. Then they say the West won't pull out. We give you an ideological reason the West is likely to pull out in the future. Opening opposition is wrong when they say Iran is part of the Axis evil that can fight the SAF. This is nonsense. Actually, the SAF in many cases has turned to Iranian support precisely because the Saudis and the UAE started backing the RSF. As a consequence, the US is likely to perceive the RSF as in ideological ties with Iran, which also reduces their political incentive to continue giving them as much support. Then they say, all carrot, no stick, you do not get meaningful negotiations. The key burden that they need to meet for this argument to be true is the capacity of Western aid to reach the RSF sufficiently. Here's the problem, the SAF sufficiently. The RSF has targeted border regions. It has countries with substantial control over trade channels, and it has a substantial asymmetry in access to weapons. What does this mean? A lot of Western military aid won't even reach people within the SAF whom they want to support. Western boots on the ground are obviously going to be limited due to political constraints. All of this means the RSF continuing to get huge amounts of funding from the Saudis and the UAEs gives them an overwhelming strategic advantage over the SAF that the US cannot create. They say the leaders of the RSF are not rational, but the lack of rationality means it's much more embarrassing to stand down against Western forces who give them the ability to galvanize. I want to explain why our extension matters in this debate against opening government specifically. They name two types of intervention that they care about. The first one is helping kill SAF leaders. Their argument here is we stop the RSF winning because we deter the UAE. This is insufficient deterrence to the UAE. Let me respond to Sophie's arguments here. First, she says, you kill RSF... Wait, hold on. What does she say? Oh, first she says it's a knife of OOO, says the end of Gaza means the US will negotiate. Yeah, but once the end of Gaza and the US enters the negotiation, the RSF is in a good strategic position, meaning it is more likely to negotiate. And if the UAE thinks the RSF is in a good strategic position, its investments with the RSF are much more secure, so I don't understand why this is a knife. Their second response is the UAE doesn't have to be ideologically pro the RSF just because it is supporting them in Yemen. But our whole argument is the types of support that the RSF gave the UAE, for example, funding Libyan warlords, is support the UAE cares about in order to stop the spread of political Islam that is opposed to the Wahhabist ideology that Saudi and the UAE want to spread. As a consequence, it is a strong ideological alignment. Third, they say the US will backlash against you, the UAE gains more from the US relationship. First, I want you to look, before that, Manuel.
The easiest way to vote over in government is we characterize that the strongest militaries in the world with better weapons, tactical training, and a hold of the UAE can take down parts of the RSF, set like forms of aid, and you don't ever explain why the counter.
Yeah, but no. But here's the problem. Western militaries are unlikely to send their most advanced tactical weapons to Sudan in a context where the UAE is likely to substantially back them with their advanced tactical weapons, and they don't want to get in a fight. And here's why Saudi and the UAE have asymmetric leverage. They have other buyers of their oil. For example, China. US cares substantially politically about preventing oil prices from going up because that causes the price of every other good to go up. This is why Trump opposed Biden's efforts to raise oil prices by supporting Ukraine. The Trump administration is unlikely to be willing to cede to the UAE on this. See, for example, Saudi just getting a slap on the wrist even after they killed an American journalist in Jamal Khashoggi. The reality is there is substantial amounts of leverage that these states have over the US, meaning they will continue engaging in substantial amounts of funding. They say in OG that the RSF would continue genocide against ethnic groups like the Masalit if they win. But persistent genocide is unlikely, precisely because if the Saudi and the UAE care about their investments, they want to reduce conflict in Sudan once the RSF has strongholds, because conflict scares off their investors, and the RSF cares about getting Saudi and UAE investment, meaning they are unlikely to advocate persistent genocide. The humanitarian corridor is worse. There are incentives for aid right now, floods of refugees into regions and images that cause people to empathize. But the presence of military reduces the incentive to send aid because you want to fund the military instead, so their argument on aid is also flipped.
This for the rest of time. Surely this is super that gets all weapons to disappear. Surely in every conflict and war motion I could counter model I'm gonna make all the weapons in the world disappear. Yes, world peace. How does this happen, right? There's compliance costs. So even if we bought this was true, the cost to do this, to convince countries to do this internationally, the sanctions and embargoes and negotiations you would have to undertake are surely better used on our side of the house, and we weigh that comparative efficacy. But second, there's probably really large economic costs, which is why we weigh why these costs are better on our side of the house spent on other kinds of things. They also just don't respond to half of the rebuttal they get about why they have less control, why ethnic violence exists with places that are only armed with guns, why there's very cheap guns that can also exist, why you don't get massive losses of legitimacy when the UN is working with things like Russia and China. Very, very unclear to me. And at the point where their case hinges on a counter model and ours just exists in real life, I think we can very cleanly take this debate.